In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Spanish usted that we began a week ago. We'll discuss what it means to address someone in a familiar versus formal way, and how native Spanish speakers decide whether to use familiar or formal address. And we'll give you, as a non-native speaker of Spanish, some rules of thumb for deciding when you should use familiar versus formal address. The textbook explanation of familiar versus formal address in Spanish goes like this. Familiar address, either tú or vos depending on the country, is used with family, people who are your friends or close acquaintances, people who are your social equal, and children. Formal address is used with strangers, people in older generations than you, people who are higher than you on the social scale, such as your boss when you're at work and your professors when you're in class, or any time it would be appropriate to show someone a bit more respect. I think this is a perfectly good starting place for understanding familiar versus formal address, but I think there's another useful way of developing an intuition for how to use it, and that's to relate it to a similar concept we have in our English-speaking culture, and that's the idea of being on a first-name basis with someone. Let me explain using my own upbringing as an example. In the small rural community where I was raised, we were quite old-fashioned in how we addressed people. I addressed other young people by their first name, but I was taught to address young adult women as Miss, and married people as Mr. and Mrs. It would have been impolite for me to refer to adults by their first name, even someone I knew well, like my friend's parents, although they did address me by my first name. The only adults I addressed by their first name were my extended family and my parents' closest friends, who were like family. Moreover, adults in my community didn't address one another by their first name if they didn't know one another well. My parents generally addressed other adults as Miss, Mr., or Mrs. This was especially true for people who held important roles in the community, such as religious leaders, teachers, business owners, and people who worked at City Hall. Of course, anyone whose occupation had a title associated with it, such as doctor, police officer, judge, professor, pastor, or principal, were addressed using their title. In the community where I grew up, there was an important distinction between addressing a friend, social equal, or child by their first name, and using Miss, Mr., Mrs., or a professional title with strangers, people who were older than you, people who were higher than you on the social ladder, people with whom you didn't have a close relationship, or people who occupied an important position in the community. This is what we mean when we speak of being on a first-name basis with someone, and this distinction is easily understandable as familiar versus formal or casual versus polite. Something we don't always think of is that this distinction can be used for other purposes. For example, if an adult ordinarily addressed another adult as Mr., he might use that person's first name during a disagreement to indicate that he was upset with that person. Obviously, this isn't an example of friendliness. Rather, addressing someone in too familiar a way indicates the opposite of friendliness. And an adult who normally addresses a child by his first name might address him as Mr. when scolding him. Obviously, this isn't an example of politeness or respect. What he's indicating is a distance between him and the child. And there are many, many more situations like these, where using the form of address that's the opposite of what is normally expected is the opposite of friendly and the opposite of polite. And these situations don't need to be explained to an English speaker. Our intuition generally tells us what tone is intended. Of course, different English-speaking communities have different standards for when it's appropriate to address someone by their first name. In the past, most communities had well-established distinctions, and everyone knew what they were. In modern times, we tend to be much less formal, and the concept of when it's appropriate to address someone by their first name is a lot blurrier. Understandably, people of previous generations often prefer more traditional address. Interestingly, small communities tend to be more traditional, while big cities tend to be less so. Across the English-speaking world, there's nothing like a consistent standard of what it means to be on a first-name basis. It's something we understand intuitively, based on our particular upbringing, with variation from generation to generation and place to place. Okay, so the reason I went to such lengths to describe this English-speaker cultural phenomenon is because it's a very close parallel to the concept of familiar versus formal address in Spanish. Many of the same sorts of situations apply. In Spanish, as a general rule, you use tú or vos with people who are friends, close acquaintances, and social equals, and you use usted with people with whom you don't have a close relationship, people higher than you on the social scale, people to whom it would be appropriate to show a bit more respect, strangers, or people who occupy an important position in the community. In a very similar way, using tú or vos with someone with whom you would normally use usted may not indicate friendliness in Spanish, but rather a lack of respect. And using usted when the relationship normally calls for tú or vos doesn't always imply something respectful and positive. In other close parallels, Spanish-speaking cultures all over the world have become less formal over time, with people tending to use tú or vos in situations in which their parents or grandparents would have used usted. And rural communities tend to maintain more traditional ways of addressing people, with well-established distinctions between familiar and formal, while in urban areas those distinctions are blurrier than they were a few generations ago. All right. So rather than trying to make detailed lists of all the occasions when you should use familiar address and when you should use formal address, I've tried to help you understand the concept by relating it to a close parallel that we have in our language and culture, and it really is a fairly close parallel. Of course, there are some differences. For one, it's normal in Spanish-speaking cultures to call someone by their first name and still address them as usted. This combination of someone's first name and usted is a subtler way of showing respect or social distance than we have available to us in English. But I still feel that understanding the concept in this way is the best way to develop your intuition for when to use usted. Of course, different countries and regions use familiar and formal forms differently. I don't have time to discuss every country in this video, but here are a couple interesting examples. Spain. In Spain in recent generations, tú has emerged as the preferred form of address in many situations that previously called for usted. Nowadays, it's normal for children to address not only family and friends as tú, but often strangers. This even when they aren't apparently of the same generation or apparent social background. It's my understanding that it isn't uncommon for young people to use tuteo when addressing adults in positions of authority, such as their school teachers. In Spain, if a conversation between strangers begins with usted, it may shift into tú after just a few sentences. For many Spaniards, tuteo is preferred because its use implies that there's no necessary social distance between speakers. Tuteo has come to symbolize the speech of the younger generations, as well as their sense of equality and modernity, and as a consequence has largely displaced many of the traditional uses of usted. Of course, Spain is a very culturally diverse nation, and there are undoubtedly places that still maintain more traditional uses of usted. Any Spaniards who can give us their understanding of tú versus usted and how they're used in Spain, we'd love to read your comments. Costa Rica. Historically, in Costa Rica, the second-person singular forms of address were vos and usted, with the normal expected uses. Vos as familiar and friendly address, and usted as formal and polite address. But over time, usted has emerged as the preferred form in many situations that previously called for vos. In other words, in a way very different from other Spanish-speaking cultures, usted may be used in relationships of closeness, intimacy, and familiarity. Here's a post from a language forum written by a Costa Rican about second-person address in his country, translated from Spanish and lightly edited for clarity. In Costa Rica, something really interesting has happened. Usted is no longer used only to denote respect and social distance, but has adopted the same function as vos. For example, school children use usted with each other. People switch back and forth between usted and vos without even realizing it. Strangely enough, I use vos with my parents and grandparents and usted with cousins and siblings. A very common thing is for people to go back and forth between the two forms with the same person in the same conversation. To complicate the situation, there's a strong cultural influence from tuteo-speaking countries such as Mexico, Panama, and Colombia. So people don't just alternate between vos and usted, but also combine vos with the verb forms of tú. For example, it isn't all that unusual to hear people say vos tienes or tú no podés. The second is less common, but it happens. Costa Ricans generally don't like it when you use straight tuteo, but with a continual cultural influence from other countries, we're less and less sensitive to the introduction of tuteo in our language. Regarding the relative frequency of vos and usted in Costa Rica, I can't find any hard data. I know that in media and government messaging they almost always use vos. Another theory I've heard is that vos is typical of the metropolitan area, while usted is more common in the provinces, but I'm not sure about that. I don't have much personal experience with Costa Rican Spanish, and while I found a few papers on the subject, I couldn't find anything that described the situation better than this. Any Costa Ricans who'd like to contribute their opinions and experiences regarding the use of usted, vos, and tú, we'd love to read your comments. Other observations. Most of my personal observations of familiar versus formal address in Latin America align reasonably well with the textbook explanation and my English speaker intuitions about being on a first-name basis. But I've certainly observed other uses. Here's some interesting examples. Years ago, when I lived in Ecuador, I had a friend from a small rural community who said that as a child, his parents addressed him as tú, while he addressed them as usted. And he said that one of the proudest days of his life was when he got married, and his father began addressing him as usted. This is unusual because in most Spanish-speaking cultures, immediate family don't use formal address with each other. Apparently, in his community, being a married adult brought certain respect with it, even between family members. When I lived in Quito, I knew a woman who addressed her dog as tú, but her cats as usted. I found this really interesting, and I wondered if she was consciously aware that she addressed her pets differently. There is a usage of usted in Latin America where parents call their children usted when being particularly affectionate, and my guess is that this woman was using usted in this sense with her cats. I observed this affectionate use of usted between parents and their children a couple of times in Latin America, especially parents talking a sort of baby talk to their newborn infants. I think a rough equivalent to this in English-speaking culture is when parents call their daughter princess. These examples and countless others like them are difficult to explain using the textbook explanation of familiar versus formal address. But they're easy to explain when you understand that native Spanish speakers don't just use this contrast for familiar versus formal, but also use it to indicate closeness versus distance, casualness versus gentility, and even ordinary friendliness versus some kind of special tenderness. The variety of uses for this contrast makes it impossible to describe every situation in detail, and they vary from dialect to dialect, so I'll leave you with this general recommendation. As a non-native Spanish speaker, it's wise to generally follow this pattern when addressing people. Use familiar address, either tú or vos depending on the version of Spanish you use, with people who are your friends or close acquaintances, people your age and who are your social equal, or children. Use usted with strangers, people in an older generation than you, people who are higher than you on the social ladder in a particular environment, such as your boss when you're at work or your professors when you're in class, or people in a professional setting. Use usted anytime you suspect you ought to be showing a bit more formality or respect. Different Spanish-speaking communities have different standards for when it's appropriate to use familiar versus formal address, and what works perfectly well in one culture may not be appropriate for another. So pay close attention to how people around you address one another and try your best to imitate them. When in doubt, it's safest to use usted with new acquaintances. Listen closely, and if you find that they begin using tú with you, that's an indication that in this culture, this relationship normally calls for tú, and you're safe to use tú with them as well. If they continue to use usted with you, then you should probably stick with usted. If someone would prefer that you use tú with them, they'll often let you know, saying something like, puedes tratarme de tú, or puedes tutearme, which both mean something like, you can use tú with me. I have observed the opposite situation, and it was a bit uncomfortable. I remember one occasion during a study abroad program in Mexico, an American student who hadn't gotten the hang of familiar versus formal address used tú when speaking with a Mexican woman who was probably older than his parents. His overly informal treatment made her uncomfortable, and after a few minutes she said to him, as politely as she could, por favor, tráteme de usted. He didn't really understand what she wanted, and we had to give him some one-on-one lessons on tú versus usted. Now, in the comment section of my last video, a native speaker from Spain left some very important and interesting comments. I feel that the best way to respond to them is with a video, which I'm making right now and should come out in a couple of weeks. To those who are following this series on usted, keep your eyes open for that video. Alright, this has been our discussion of familiar versus formal address and when to use each. If you've enjoyed this video or learned something from it, please give it a like and share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel.